Spike Ops Info Podcast, a series on the secret undercover political police who infiltrated over 1,000 campaign groups since 1968. Episode 27, Interim Report. So welcome to the Spike Ops Info Podcast. My name is Tom Fowler and I'm joined with...
Kate Wilson.
Jessica.
Chris Brighton.
Yeah, it's been a while since we did a recording, so sorry for not being as regular as we used to be. This episode will be looking at the Undercover Policing Inquiryhas, maybe like 2 weeks ago now, I guess, published their first report. I mean, it's been 8 years. They spent 64 million quid. And they published an interim report which basically looks at Tranche 1 of the Undercover Policing Inquiry. For those of you who don't remember all the jargon, Tranche 1 refers to formation of the unit up until 1982, so 1968 until 1982. This interim report wasn't originally planned, but given that it's been taking so long to get to this point, the inquiry felt it needed to do something. It needed to show that it was actually, going somewhere. We didn't have a lot of hope for what it was liable to come out of the report. We weren't expecting much from the report. Anybody who's a regular listener to this podcast will know we don't expect much from the inquiry in general. But there were some things. There was a great deal of interest from the report. So over the next half hour, 45 minutes, however long it takes us, we're going to break down what the report said, what we thought was good, what we thought was bad, what was missing. And believe me, there's plenty that was missing. So, guys, what did you think? Chris, what did you make of the report?
I suppose the headline which was picked up by the media, etc., was the fact that Mitting said that the Special Demonstration Squad should have been wound up pretty shortly after it began. Obviously, we don't think it should have begun in the first place, but that is a relatively strong statement. The headline behind that, he said that all but 3 of the undercover deployments were not justified. So that's the good news from the report, I guess.
3 out of several hundred, I think, groups. I don't know how many groups were infiltrated in Tranche 1. I mean, part of the problem is that they won't give us the full list of the groups. And in fact, 2 out of the 3 groups that Mitting has chosen to say it was justified to infiltrate, he won't actually tell the public what they were. So it's very difficult to really assess. The one that he has mentioned is an English group called Provisional Sinn Féin, which he claims was funding the IRA, but we don't know anything about the other 2 groups.
Yeah, there is another version of this report. What we've actually seen is a redacted version of the report which was given to the Home Secretary, which does name those groups and includes the information from the closed hearings, which we were unable to attend and which we know nothing about, which refers to these much more serious, this was fully justified behaviours. What are your thoughts, Jessica?
I think, like you say, I mean, we weren't expecting very much from the report. I guess what I'm more concerned about is if you give Mitting 2 sides, so what the police have said and, the other side, what the CPs have said, that, he's really picking who he believes. And so, in the case of Vince Harvey, where he said that, his relationship that he had, was a couple of one-night stands. And then, he listens to Madeleine, who he liked her as a witness, found her very believable. And so he believes her version of it. But then you've got other instances where he's taken the side of the officer, but not really explained why. I think the other one is Diane Langford, where she has said that there was, I can't remember who it was, one of the undercover officers had been recognised in a meeting. And Diane Langford said that the officer then threatened the woman that was in the meeting to say, basically, don't say, that I'm a cop or something, and threatens her family in Ireland. And Mitting's comments on that, he says, he doesn't believe that actually happened, that he doesn't believe that the officer threatened her. She would have known he could pose no threat to her family. How does he know that? He doesn't know that. It's there's no, we've not got the evidence of why. I mean, if you think, there's some undercover officer you don't really know where from, but he's in the group and he threatens your family. He knows your family are in Ireland and he threatens them. How do you know he's not going to, do something to them. That's the point. Is but he doesn't believe that Diane Langford is credible. I mean, what she said. So he doesn't. He believes the officer, and I think in too many cases he has taken the officers. He's taken what they've said as being credible. So I mean, I give evidence to the inquiry next year, and already I've had like one meeting. Women Deceived had a meeting with Mitting, and he already doesn't like me. So it's going to be whatever I say. I don't imagine that he's going to believe. I think he's going to take the side of Coles, who's Coles is lying. That's the officer that I had the relationship with. He's lying and said it never happened. And this has just made me think, it doesn't matter what I say, he's going to believe Coles, because Coles is police, and police don't lie, do they?
Yeah, he thanked all the police who gave evidence. He didn't thank any of the non-state witnesses. I thought that was quite telling. Sorry, Chris. Anyway,
I was going to say this is Dave Robertson was the officer. So I mean, Mitting, that is one example of one of the issues that runs throughout the report. It's Mitting's credulity in terms of the honesty of what the officers said throughout. Generally speaking, he classified their evidence as honest throughout, even when there was, I think, good reason to believe that they were, perhaps you could class them as unreliable witnesses or with a track record of deception. So, for instance, the one I would pick on is Jeff Craft. He was a manager during the mid-1970s, and he basically oversaw 2 miscarriages of justice involving an undercover officer, cover name Barry Loader. And he was involved in basically nobbling the courts so that there was no danger of the officer being discovered as an undercover officer, and several other people were convicted in those cases. And in fact, 2 of those people now have been referred by Mitting himself to the CCRC, the Criminal Court Review Commission. And yet Mitting says that he was an honest witness. An honest witness, he would happily prefer the cause of justice, which is kind of a bit of a weird combination in my view, but yeah.
I think the correct term for it is takes the piss.
I was being understated, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite hard. I mean, we want this to be entertaining. This, it's a podcast. We want people to listen to us, but at the same time, it's a really spectacularly boring report in a lot of ways. I mean, there's no summary. It's 95 pages long. I read all of it and did quite a lot of work to try and make it comprehensible. And it's as with everything the inquiry does, it's not presented in a way that makes it accessible. It's not presented in a way that makes it something that people are going to want to know. And at the same time, the conclusions in it, when you dig through it and really look at what it's saying, are absolutely devastating for the police and for the spy cops unit. So I think it's quite hard to get that across when you pick out the little bits of what it's saying. But at the end of the report, it basically drew 4 conclusions. There were 4 points in it where it said that the identity theft, the stealing of dead children's identities, the forming of relationships. And I think it's important that he didn't just say, putting these officers in for a long time meant forming sexual relationships, which obviously did happen. And he said that, it started in the 70s and became a perennial feature of the SDS. But he also talked about how putting officers in for such a long time meant forming deep and lasting friendships with people, which is also really problematic. The other 2 conclusions were, help me out here.
It was positions of responsibility, wasn't it?
Which is also really interesting. Talking about how officers, although at the very beginning, one of the guys that set the SDS up said, you mustn't take positions of responsibility. You mustn't be directing people's political activity. But, they were going in, they were becoming membership officers, they were becoming treasurers, they were voting on important decisions. And, the implications of that for our right to organise and for our ability to organise are really quite worrying. You know, if the police are going in and basically, you know, taking positions that change the direction of how people's political organising is going. And of course, they've got lots of resources. I mean, I've you know, most of my knowledge comes from much later in the day from Mark Kennedy's operation, but you know, that you can see when he gets involved in the G8 summit stuff, he goes straight onto the finance working group, and there's discussions with his managers about whether he should be a signatory on the bank account or not, and how important it is that he's in the finance group. But also, he had so much more resources than us. You know, Mark would take on tasks in a meeting and then just send the list to his handler and say, sort this for me, will you? So, you know, we'd like take on printing leaflets.
We need more of that kind of people.
Yeah, we do need more of that kind of people. But yeah, you know, he basically had a PA, and he had a 200,000 quid a year expenses budget to do what he was doing. And so, you know, the power imbalance that creates, and the ability for them to actually control people's political organising, is really problematic.
I mean, we saw it really like clearly with the Troops Out movement, where I mean, essentially the leadership ended up being undercover cops, and the entire movement was completely subverted from its original aim entirely.
So another point, actually, where Jeff Craft seems to be an unreliable witness is that he actually denied that he knew that undercover took the position of national convener for the Troops Out movement. But then there's a memo actually says, oh, actually, well, basically him saying that undercover took that position himself, Jeff Craft. So he obviously did know. And then he obviously, when confronted with that, he goes, oh, okay, I don't know how I let that happen. Was basically his response.
Yeah, that was Rick Gibson, wasn't it? He was like
Rick Gibson,
he was like the London organizer of Troops Out movement,
and then became the national convener. Yeah.
One of the weird things about the report, though it criticises various aspects, like how we've just discussed, and it said it should have been abolished at X point in the 1970s, it doesn't apportion blame for anything that happened to at least to anybody who appeared as a witness in Tranche 1. So in some ways, now hear me out here, Mitting's analysis is quite Marxist, because it's all about structure. It happened, the fault lies with the structure, not with the individuals within that structure. I only say that because I imagine Mitting wouldn't like that very much.
I mean, it's also known as, you know, don't hate the player, hate the game, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah.
I mean, his fourth point, just to like, was about the gaining entry into private homes. That was the fourth conclusion, which, you know, it was one of these things where just the whole basis of the unit was just, you know, driving a coach and horses through British law, really. But yeah.
Yeah, I've had the conversation about this with someone yesterday, and saying, you know, if they, you know, we still don't know. I don't know whether sort of they recorded anything in, you know, our house or anything like that. And, you know, it was a point that they would have needed, you know, to ask the Home Office if they wanted to tap our phones. But the fact that they could just, you know, we were in their houses, they were in our houses, and could have just recorded anything. Like, say, with that, you know, they didn't need any further authorization than the undercover officer.
I find it interesting that angle of the trespass appears to have come from Charlotte Kilroy's kind of transference from the IPT case of that argument. And I wonder if that would have come up at all if it hadn't, because she pulled that out of the hat completely in the IPT, Kate Wilson's IPT case. We were all just like blown away. Where's she going with this? What is it? And now it seems to have become like an important feature of the undercover inquiry.
Lawyers, I mean, obviously people who've spent their career in the law, like, you know, conservative judges like Mitting, that's gonna be right up their alley, isn't it? So you can see why that's has some play within that.
Really interesting that it wasn't until Charlotte Kilroy made those submissions about, you know, well, you know, the police keep saying these operations were lawful, these operations were legitimate. And actually, it wasn't until Charlotte came along and said, but what legal framework are you actually using to say that this was lawful and legitimate? And the police were like, oh, legal framework, we haven't got one of them.
We filled in a form. We wrote we wrote authorization.
Well, they did in
someone signed it. It was authorized. It was legal. Like, okay, that's interesting. We should try that.
And that the inquiry hadn't really considered the legal framework either. It wasn't until she made those submissions that they were like, oh, actually, maybe we do need to set out what the relevant laws are in order to actually look at what was done. And of course, once you do that, and nobody has done that since, ever until now, really. Like, the police never did it. The Home Office never did it. Nobody actually looked at what these officers were doing and said, was this even legal? And it turns out, no, it wasn't.
No. I should just, for our listeners, we are also joined by Ben, who did introduce himself, but is that other voice you've just been hearing? That's not me or Chris?
Hi, that's me. I didn't introduce myself. I was busy getting a beer.
Smooth professionalism of the Spike Ops Info podcast. But yeah, it's it's that thing, isn't it? Of like, well, they just assumed they could, so they did. That was it. They just assumed they could. So
we've said this repeatedly throughout all the other episodes. They just didn't expect to get caught, so therefore the phrase legal framework authorization just didn't. In the special demonstration squad's era, just didn't even. It was non-existent. So they just didn't think they were going to get caught, basically.
Well, they just thought no one would ever find out. I mean, that is literally what they said about the dead children's identities is, did you think this would actually cause harm to anybody? And they replied, no, we never thought anyone would find out.
What I think one or two of the managers, or maybe it was earlier, even actually blamed the inquiry stroke people who found out about it for the family's distress. Maybe it was actually an undercover, wasn't it?
It was one of the undercovers. I forget who. It was the one who looked like a like a snooker ball, but like it was like irate about how incredibly like how it was the fault of these activists and this inquiry that these people had been told what they did, and if we hadn't been poking our noses in, there'd been no harm caused. Well, they don't know what won't hurt them.
Yeah, I think that's right from like the top all the way down to the individual officers, and that is that this whole sort of they'll have protection. Nobody will ever know. So the undercovers did whatever they wanted to, thinking no one will know. The managers appear to be no different. That's the entire sort of the premise of the entire SDS and MPOIU is like no one will ever know. It'll be fine.
I noticed that a lot in the statements from the undercover officers. Basically, it was all a long time ago. I'm kind of really pissed off that this is coming up now. I'd been assured at the time that we would have had the full backing of the state. This would never come out. We would never have to be held accountable for any of this stuff. And what is this now, decades later, that we're now having to answer for something when we were told we weren't going to have to answer for it?
Not fair. It's not fair.
And I mean, actually, I don't. It's a bit hard to get to. Is it after sort of been drafting a couple of profiles of the managers, Jeff Craft and Trevor Butler, and although Mitting does say they are honest, etc., as witnesses, he does sort of, in a kind of passive-aggressive way, undermine all the managers' judgments that what they were doing was justified, because basically, in their witness statements, they more or less say, we would have had the public support, we were doing something worthwhile, the deployments were justified, but basically Mitting has basically turned around and said, not directly to their faces, but in the report, saying your judgment was completely wrong. So although Mitting has the report has a lot of shortfalls, he does as I say, in a passive aggressive way, does actually say their judgment was completely rubbish.
I mean, he specifically says if the public had become aware of what was going on, this would have immediately been shut down and it would have caused a lot of concern, which does rather fly in the face of what the police are saying. Of course, he also says, and this is one of the more interesting things in the report, and I think we're going to have to revisit this later, that although throughout the entire Tranche 1 period, so 1968 to 1982, the police did not spy on the far right at any point, that he is satisfied that the reason for that was not political bias.
Because he believes them when they say they were shit scared of infiltrating the far right, which of course is bullshit. It's an excuse. They weren't scared of infiltrating them. They were them.
Yeah, I think they probably knew what the sort of the far right were doing because they were actually at the meetings, but as sort of in their real identities.
Yeah, I mean,
there's
they
nothing.
had good sources in the far right. They had great sources in the far right. They didn't need to send infiltrators in, and they don't really specify what those sources were, but it's not hard to imagine.
I mean, it was very blatant. The evidence given by like some of the officers when they were being questioned at the inquiry, they were very open about the fact that the National Front weren't a problem. I mean, we heard that time and again from several former undercover officers that they weren't a problem. The problem was the left. If the left didn't turn up and counter demonstrate, there wouldn't have been a problem at all.
I was going to say that rather flies in the face of their other argument for why they didn't infiltrate the far right, which was, of course, that the far right were too violent and it would not be safe to infiltrate them. So to say, on the one hand, to be saying they're not a problem, on the other hand, to be saying that.
It's very similar to MPOAU's take on targeting hunt saboteurs for violence perpetrated against them. So you don't infiltrate the hunters, who are, by their own admission, the people causing the grievous bodily harm or in fact breaking the law when it came to the banning of the hunting. You'd still target the hunt saboteurs. So
again, that's an example coming from much later on. We're talking 2004, 2005. But you see that kind of ideological bias that Mitting is apparently blind to is something else that we're going to see throughout the rest of the inquiry.
I mean, quite a few of the officers actually literally say the National Front weren't infiltrated because in the Cold War context, they weren't a threat to the British state, which is perfectly true.
It is.
In that,
I mean, they're royalists, for God's sake.
Same reason that, that the anti-apartheid movement was surveilled, but the activities of the South African Security Service were allowed to happen, straight cooperated with by them. Because obviously apartheid South Africa was on the right side in the Cold War.
Yeah, but of course this is not political. You're making it sound like it's a bit political. Obviously it's not. We can't forget Mitting has, it's just not political at all.
I think another thing that came out was the really key role that was obviously played by MI5 in deciding what the police were going to do. Bearing in mind that it's not political, but it was MI5 and their counter-subversion operations that were pulling the strings on the SCS. I mean, that comes across quite clearly in the report.
It was very much a client relationship. They were customers.
I think maybe it was you, Kate, that mentioned it in another context, that maybe Mitting is going to say in his final report that although it wasn't for the police to do these surveillance activities, it would have been perfectly fine for MI5 to do them. Maybe it was somebody else who mentioned that, but I think maybe there's a hint of that in the report.
I've seen that elsewhere. I was at a talk given by Baroness Pauline something or other, who was speaking as the House of Lords liaison with MI6, if I'm not very much mistaken. And the basic gist of what she was saying was, these undercover relationships and this kind of shit show is what happens when you give a bunch of working class coppers a public schoolboy's job. And I think that there is going to be Mitting specifically in his conclusions says, and I see if I can find the quote, "The question is whether or not the end justified the means, and I have come to the firm conclusion that for a unit of a police force, it did not." And I think it's interesting that he has inserted that line because, of course, MI5 and other security service operations in the UK are governed by exactly the same laws and exactly the same legal framework as the police in this. And so, I think there's probably a lot of eyes and a lot of pressure behind the scenes on this undercover policing inquiry to try and minimise the impact that it is going to have on the activities of infiltration units that we know absolutely nothing about coming out of MI5 and God knows where else.
Shall we talk about what isn't in the report? There's quite a few gaps, isn't there?
There's loads of gaps. It's like more holes than cheese.
Yeah, Dave Smith, if he was here, would point out the word blacklisting or vetting's not mentioned at all, for instance. And despite I think in the last set of hearings, that was actually mentioned in the counsel for the inquiry's closing statement, that he did sort of draw a line between the information in the subversion committees, the secret subversion committees. But he drew a connecting line, albeit maybe a dotted one, between that and special demonstration squad surveillance and their collection of information. So and that's one of the gaps. And I think when I read the report through, I was quite shocked that of the things that weren't in there, because I would have thought that my expectation was it was going to, generally speaking, cover all of Tranche 1, if not absolutely have final conclusions in them. So I thought it would have been a bit more polite, just to let people know beforehand, okay, we're not going to deal with this issue now. This is going to be the framework for this Tranche 1 report, because I think it was quite a shock to some people that issues that were very close to their hearts weren't mentioned at all.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, so Mitting kind of started the report with a foreword where he makes the point that he's specifically not including a bunch of issues. He doesn't actually even mention blacklisting in, spying on industrial action or vetting in the list of things he's not going to look at. It doesn't even get a mention there. But he does say that he's not going to look at the impact of male police officers on the women deceived into sexual relationships. He's not going to look at the impact on the families of the officers. He's not going to look at the impact on the surviving relatives of deceased children. And he's not going to look at the purpose of gathering intelligence on family justice campaigns, or the attitude of police officers and managers within the unit towards deceitful sexual relationships. He actually did say some stuff about that in the report, which, having said that he wasn't going to, and what he said was basically that he believed the managers that they didn't know, and had they known, disciplinary action would have been taken, which I think is a very questionable conclusion to draw, and we can maybe come back to that later. The other thing he said he wasn't going to look at, which I thought was quite interesting, because he didn't include it in the list of things that he was saving to later. And it's kind of sounded like he was basically saying, I'm not going to look at this at all, he says, I'm not going to look at some of the wider issues canvassed in submissions. For example, that the SDS was one of the instruments set up by a conservative state to suppress the aspirations of those who wish to produce radical change by political means. So basically, he's not looking at whether or not it was political policing. And that is something that he is obviously very keen to avoid, probably because he is part of the conservative state that sets up instruments to suppress the aspirations of those who wish to produce radical change. But yeah, it's I think something that we're going to have to keep pushing is that this was political policing. There was political bias, and you can't get away from that. You really can't get away from that.
Absolutely. It's something which, like, all aspects of the British establishment are like, we don't do that sort of thing here. It's a key part of the whole thing with it all, isn't it? We can't, that's like what they do in the Soviet Union or something. It's not something which happens in Britain. But I think it's key. We keep banging on about that. And I think this is the wider thing. It's not, the reason that there's an inquiry isn't because of like a sequence of like individual scandals or something. It is a wider, like, structural thing of political policing, and we need to keep coming back to that, really, with our criticism of it all.
Yeah.
Does anybody else want to talk about other things that were missing from the report?
I think have to bear in mind, I haven't actually read the entire report, so probably I'm not the best to answer this. I've read the summary. I couldn't be doing with the whole thing.
It was pretty hard going. I mean, like, I've never, I never intended to be the kind of person who read like these kind of things, and like it was, I really struggled to my way through, like, just skim reading the damn thing, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, I mean, like, huge kudos to the summary which was put together. If anybody's interested, you can find it on the Police Spies Out of Lives website. I wouldn't direct anybody to read the actual report itself. I'd suggest they read the summary. The link will be in the show notes.
The fact that it needed a summary and that there was no executive summary officially in the document itself seemed to really work out well for us, because who the hell is going to read 95 pages plus another 30 of appendix or something insane like that? and then gave the media a couple of hours to sit in a room and try to find some sense in it. Yeah, I mean, it was crazy and played well for art, I think.
I mean, yeah, I think the media coverage of the report was quite fascinating, because what we saw was the chair published the report, locked a bunch of journalists in a room for 2 hours to give them a chance to read it, and that was it. There was no press release by the public inquiry, no executive summary of what was said in the report. The police issued a slightly pathetic statement reiterating apologies that they supposedly made, but actually you could spend quite a while searching on the internet, try and find the apologies they were talking about and fail. And we're still trying to chase down what apologies they were supposedly reiterating in that statement. And that was it. And so all of the content came from us. And we found like a press conference that we almost didn't even do ended up being live streamed on the BBC and Sky News for like over an hour,
including an empty table for 20 minutes.
Yeah, with BBC journalists adding commentary and library footage of demonstrations from the 1960s and 70s on it. I mean, it really was like unheard of, the media response to our content, and I think the reason for that was because everyone else was a bit like, oh, nothing to see here, folks.
I was just saying, like, I think it speaks to the fact that, like, what we've seen is a redacted version of the report. That the as far as what Mitting was actually much more concerned with was the version that he delivered to the Home Secretary, which includes stuff that we don't get to see, and it's yet again the establishment talking to itself, and the fact that we get to like a little window into part of it is not really any of their concern.
It's actually the establishment talking to Suella Braverman.
I can't imagine Suella Braverman reading the report. I imagine it straight in the bin with a comment about the blob and lefty lawyers.
I mean, I suppose there are probably some Home Office civil servants who are looking at what it says, but yeah, when you put it like that, when you say this report was going to the Home Secretary, it's a slightly depressing and scary thought. To be honest, any thought about the Home Secretary is slightly depressing and scary.
I mean, they're only the worst Home Secretary since the last one.
Yeah,
I would
none
just
of them
say,
are great, are they?
No, that's the role of Home Secretary generally. I would just say that there were some papers who went out of their way to find quotes from Mitting to use rather than take stuff straight from our own statement, our own summary. And one of those was that there was no political bias in the fact that they didn't spy on the right. That was one of the quotes which got used a fair amount. So you can kind of see his purpose in saying it. I mean, it's clearly untrue, but you say it, somebody reports it, somebody else says that this has been said, and so on and so on and so forth, and it helps to maintain the lie.
I did feel we should mention the fact that there was no mention at all of the evidence that Celia Stubbs gave in the report at all, which was very upsetting for her. She actually issued a written statement to say that. Celia, of course, was the partner of Blair Peach, who was murdered by the Special Patrol Group, anti-fascist demo in Southall.
The sheer disrespect shown to Celia Stubbs by this inquiry just continues a long line of disrespect by the British state against her. I mean, like, it is stomach-churningly like foul the way in which, I mean, like, just horrendous. Like the showing of that that video of the funeral, you know, just completely unprepared. Oh yes, we've got this secret recording of you at the funeral of your murdered partner, and we're just going to like throw it into proceedings and announced. It's like, what the fuck, man? Jesus. Like, yeah. She really pissed them off, eh?
To give further context, she was spied on from 1976, so 3 years before Blair's murder, up till the mid-1990s. So you would have thought that would have merited like one or two mentions within the report.
Yeah, I mean, and also I think, you know, it's not just that Celia's evidence wasn't mentioned. It is that demonstration and the death of Blair Peach and, you know, the history of that came up over and over again in Tranche 1. It wasn't. It's not just like a statement that didn't get a mention in the report. It's like a really significant incident that I think is maybe mentioned once. You know, the fact that it happened. And there, I guess it's possible that when he says, I'm not going to draw any conclusions now about the purpose of spying on justice groups. You know, what he meant was, I'm not going to touch Celia Stubbs and the murder of Blair Peach until I've gathered more evidence about the other, you know, justice campaigns against people who died after contact with the police, or the bigger picture. So it may be that it's going to come up later on. But yes, it is horrifying the way that has been handled.
That's what I mean by the impoliteness, because you would have thought that Celia at least would have been notified prior to the release of the report that wasn't going to be covered, rather than it being a shock.
Absolutely.
Another insult to her. It just seems so blatantly rude.
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of sort of expense, you know, a lot of consideration given to the police, and you know how fragile they are, and how, you know, not to sort of upset them and their families and that. But I don't feel that that's, you know, extended to the CPs, you know, particularly as you say, like Celia. And I don't know, I the more, you know, that I read this, the more it comes out of sort of there's definitely the, you know, the them and us sides, you know, and exactly, you know, the bias that Mitting shows towards them, you know, it's that I think it's more evident than I imagined that it sort of it would be. And I think that's, you know, that's one of the that's going to be an issue in, you know, in any more sort of proceedings, you know, if this is where he's going to start to show sort of where he sits on lots of things. I don't feel confident in sort of the rest of the inquiry if this is sort of the, you know, the first hint of what we get of how he's thinking about these things. It doesn't fill me with hope.
I mean, I think there's an interesting point that, I mean, we've been pushing for a long time now for a panel to sit alongside Mitting, a panel made up of people who understand institutional racism, who understand institutional sexism, who understand the kind of issues facing, and let's face it, the kind of issues facing policing today. This isn't just about the SDS. You know, these are the findings from this inquiry are going to be really important going forwards, because the police were put on special measures last June for these issues. And Mitting kind of implied before the report was published that we might, once we've read the report, we might want to reconsider the need for a panel, presumably because he felt that the fact that he would be writing a report that is devastating to the police would make us feel like it wasn't necessary. You know, when you read the report and you see like the lack of sensitivity to so many of those issues in it, and yet he thought that this would make us change our minds about his ability to judge on those issues. So he obviously, you know, I mean, the report is damning to the police, but it just misses on so many of the subtleties about bias and about prejudice that are exactly why a panel is required.
Yeah, I think Mitting thinks that with this report, you know, suddenly we consider him one of us, you know, which is not quite. But I mean, what he actually says, he stresses that it's not within his terms of reference to inquire into how or by whom the fatal injuries were inflicted, nor into the manner in which the MPS handled the subsequent investigation. This is about the death of Blair Peach. I think that's the only mention that it got.
I think that's an important point. Whenever the final report comes out, I mean, these big reports, maybe they're not read by so many people, but you know, the executive summaries are widely reported, and it is a version of history, isn't it? And what people like Mitting and the government don't want is a version of history with lots of state murders in it. They don't want those things repeated. And be talked about in general. They don't want that to be part of the public conversation, do they? So by doing that, they are creating a certain narrative of history, aren't they?
Yeah, totally. And it's all about controlling that history, right? That's been the whole bloody point of doing this kind of exercise from their point of view anyway. And it's the reason why we've gotten so involved with it, right? It's about like, you know, challenging that history, because I think, you know, the reality of the not just the undercover policing units, but the wider like infrastructure of repression has fundamentally altered the course of British history. You know, I mean, it's a wider point, but like there's no two ways about it. We live in a very different country now. If the political movements that were developed in this country since 1968 were able to like, you know, flourish in the way that they actually did, and actually should have done, and like the kind of the levels of public support that those causes had was you know, reflected in what happened. That didn't happen because of, and we can see it with the way in which that the far right wasn't suppressed. And despite the fact that this was, you know, incredibly small numbers of people supported these groups, yet they went on and had a huge impact on British culture and the way in which the state has developed. You know, and we see that today. But we're going very off topic from the fucking inquiry. Well, I'm going very off topic from the inquiry interim report here.
I thought it's relevant. It's relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think like looking at what's missing from the report and the stuff that it says. I mean, looking forward to tranche 2. Do we know when tranche 2 is going to be happening? It's like summer 2024, they're saying.
Yeah, sometime 2024, I think.
So originally it was spring 2024, and then but the inquiry issue these update notes, and notably there was it just said 2024. So that, to me, that means it might end up being autumn by the time tranche 2 starts.
Seems very likely to me.
It wasn't all that long ago. Yeah, it wasn't all that long ago that the inquiry team were trying to tell us that tranche 2 would happen in like maybe March next year, and would even be getting hearings from tranche 3 at the end of next year, which, I mean, we didn't really take too seriously. And it seems that we're correct in that, because now they can't even tell us when in 2024.
For any of the other tranches, have they? They've just said that tranche 2 will happen in 2024, and everything else has been kicked into the long grass.
Yeah, I mean, their initial excuse for why it was taking so long to get to tranche 2 is because they were preparing everything so that we would just go tranche 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like one after the other in quick succession. But there's been no mention of any of that for quite some time. And so many of the faces who running the inquiry have changed that, you know, it would be almost ridiculous to suggest, to even think that the current lot would honor what any of the previous lot had said.
Or even know.
Yeah, or even fucking know, right? Do you know what I mean? This is, I mean, I swear down, it's a tactic, you know. That's how these things kind of are allowed to run on in the way that they have, you know.
It may be a tactic. I have to say, it's not one that I think is necessarily going to work very well for them. I mean, it certainly hasn't so far, you know. I mean, apart from wasting decades of our lives having to keep up the pressure and keep campaigning, I think that there's a sense to which, I mean, first of all, the fact that, and this is something that came out quite strongly in the interim report and in the hearings for tranche 1, is the extent to which the movements that were active back then and that were considered to be, you know, enemies of the state are now pretty much all on the right side of history. Like,
right, totally.
You know, so in the course of the 10 years that I was taking the police through the courts, attitudes around sexism in the police changed very dramatically against them. And I believe that we got rulings in my case in 2021 that we never would have got in 2012 when we started. You know, so them kicking stuff into the long grass is bad in some ways, but I also think that, you know, and the fact that this story is just dragging on and on and on and just keeps coming back and keeps getting worse for them, you know, and so, you know, it's boring that they're making it last so long, but I am not totally convinced that it is entirely working in their favour.
I mean, it's working in the people's favour who were in positions of responsibility, because most of them have retired from public life, so the impact on them is less than it would have been if things were still speeded up. I mean, by the time we get to tranche 4, even undercover officers who were undercovers back in 2011, they're likely to be retired, aren't they? Not just not that they wouldn't be in senior positions anymore. They would have been, you know, because the police, generally speaking, still, as far as I know, retire at 50 as a rule. They have a full pension at 50, so they're all going to be retired, aren't they? So there is that.
Well, if they've got any sense. I mean, that's another interesting thing that happened. I know that's not what we're talking about, but Jim Boyling had a plenary hearing last week, another one. Jim Boyling was a police officer who infiltrated Reclaim the Street and Hunt Sabs in the 90s, had relationships with at least 2 women. He had a second disciplinary hearing over sexual relationships that he'd had undercover last week, which found against him. But it was quite interesting because the defence that he ran was that his boss and superior had also been an undercover officer and had had 4 relationships whilst undercover and also fathered a child. That's Bob Lambert. And that other undercover officers at the same time were also having relationships. And he basically, ran on a defence of, I was only doing my job and now I'm being hung out to dry, which is, I think, is going to get a bit interesting because, of course, they were all at it and it was systematic institutional practice to use these relationships in the undercover operations. And to an extent, these undercover officers are being hung out to dry because, actually the entire management structure was in on it. And now their damage limitation line is, well, yeah, there were some bad officers in there and we failed to deal with that and we're dealing with it now. And I think we might well see more of these undercover officers turning on their bosses and just saying, look, this is bollocks, you all knew what was going on. And up until now they've been holding the line to a certain extent. There aren't that many of them who have, one of the points that we made in our closing statements to Tranche 1 was that the police protect themselves, and you can see it throughout the evidence that they gave in Tranche 1 that, they will maybe chuck a few sacrificial lambs. They might speak ill of the dead, for example. If there are officers who are now deceased, they might say, well, yeah, actually, yeah, he was a bit of a womanizer and everyone kind of knew it. But, but they won't say anything that will implicate each other. And the managers, it's very rare. And even to the point of ridicule, where you have those 2 managers who claimed to never have served together, not know each other and have no recollection of each other. And actually the documents show them overlapping by several months and both being involved with dealing with a case where an undercover officer was caught having a sexual relationship. And those are incidentally the 2 officers that Mitting describes as 2 honest witnesses genuinely trying to give a proper account of what was going on and clearly failing. And he finds that they did know each other and they did work together. But and I think that's also interesting, is that basically these officers are liars. I don't even think it's libelous to say that. That was their job. They are trained professional liars, and they're going to lie. That is the policing culture, and that is what they're doing. We've seen that is what they're doing. They are protecting the police as an institution, and they're protecting themselves and their colleagues. And Mitting does not want to see that. I imagine Mitting doesn't want to see that in part because having a bunch of liars giving evidence to a public inquiry makes a bit of a mockery of the public inquiry. So unless there is really, really clear evidence that they are lying, in which case he says, in this instance, I find that, the alternative account is preferable, he's just going to believe what they're saying, because otherwise, what do you do? If you say, well, it looks like all of my witnesses are lying, what do you do? I mean, I've wandered a bit off topic, I think, but
I mean, one of the things there's the pragmatic argument, isn't there, for how Mitting's treated the police witnesses, saying that he's been very kind to them, so all the rest of them will turn up because they know they're going to be treated with kid gloves when they get there. Going back to say, but the evidence that the managers gave, even if you're being generous to them and saying they were being as honest as they could, given their memories and how long ago it was, etc., given that their memories were clearly faulty, and missing does say that they clearly were mistaken, then they must be counted as unreliable witnesses in that sense, at least, that their evidence is not credible, not necessarily because they're liars, which is we think, but at least because they clearly don't remember stuff clearly and accurately.
I mean, I think it's going to get interesting as we go forward, because of course there's more documents, particularly once you get into the digital age. I believe that for tranche 4 and for tranche, I guess it's tranche 4, 3 and 4, for the MPOIU, they have something like 50 million files. I think that came out in your case, I think, didn't it, Tom? That
yes, yeah.
They've got millions of digital files, and so those kind of faulty memories are going to become easier to contrast with stuff that actually got written down, which is where in a lot of the instances, unless we have other witnesses from our side coming forward, and I'm not sure that my memory is all that much better than your average octogenarian police officer, but
I mean, you'd be hard pressed to be as bad, mate. Do you know what I mean? Like the bingo scorecard, we were, with like, I can't remember. It was a long time ago.
I don't recall.
I don't recall. I mean, Jesus Christ, it was painful, wasn't it?
Yeah,
and it was the things that they didn't recall that were the things, anything that could have made them look bad, or any sort of anything that would have like admitted sort of some kind of like liability in that. It was always I just don't remember. It was I mean, it was embarrassingly obvious. Sort of, I was sat watching it, and it wasn't even a sort of a convincing lie at the time.
No, it was a no comment interview, essentially, but you can't give a no comment interview to a public inquiry that has given you immunity from prosecution. So the alternative is I don't recall, I don't remember. It was a long time ago.
I totally get that strategy of admitting of like he's got to be nice to them, otherwise, because they could just not turn up, right? Do you know what I mean? It wouldn't be surprising.
I'm not actually sure what the rules are under the Inquiries Act. I'm not sure they can just not turn up.
Missing, maybe it was even pitched for this. If they do have the powers, if they're in the UK, they can make them give evidence. But I'm pretty sure it was missing, or even pitched for this, said they wouldn't use those powers to compel them to appear.
I think they said they wouldn't use those powers against us. I'm not sure they've said they wouldn't use those powers against the police.
I might be wrong. It was a long time. It would have been in the preliminary hearing, so it was a while ago.
Anyway, if they start refusing to show up, we'll see.
Is there anything else about this interim report people want to comment on?
There's one thing that I'm looking for, and actually I'm looking to try and find it, but they've said that I think whether it was in closed hearings, but the officers or somebody mentioned having sort of like it wasn't 2 one-night stands and a grope or something.
That was in the risk assessments. There was one of the officers.
Oh, HM 155 then, I think.
One of the officers told his risk assessment analyst.
I've got it. Phil Cooper, HM 155, is recorded as having had 2 or 3, possibly more, sexual relationships, and the encounters would have followed drink. He gave conflicting evidence to risk assessors and to the inquiry. However, admitting accepts that these relationships did take place. Like no women had come forward to give any other sort of evidence. I'm not even sure actually if that is the one, Kate. But no woman has come forward to give evidence about that. But one of the reasons is because there's no cover name. So it would be, we're going back a long way, and said, no women has come forward to give any other version of that. But if they don't, sometimes a name is quite useful, and it's almost as though the inquiry is, surprised that they haven't come forward and given any other account of it, but it's not bring up the fact that we haven't released the name. So, that's why if they don't, then you can't have like witnesses if they don't know who the officer was. I don't know. It's one of the things that we originally sort of fought for was more transparency and things. When you're talking about this long ago, does he, and the risk to the officers and that, this the people that are in their 70s and 80s now. There's no. I mean, or they might be embarrassed. Some of the officers might be embarrassed if people found out who they were back in the day. But hopefully going forward, there's going to be, like you say, Kate, more sort of like digital evidence and that, and photos and things. But
yeah, so Vicky said that about 2 different officers, HN 302 and HN 21, that the female involved has not given evidence, so Mitting chooses to believe the officer. Yeah, I believe that neither of those officers, he has published their cover names.
Yeah, that's it. After an evening in the pub, this officer and a female activist went to his cover flat where they had protected sex intercourse by joint agreement. Mitting states that he's not heard from the female activist without recognising that the inquiry has chosen to restrict HN 302's cover name, and there is no way this woman would even know she was deceived in this relationship.
So what we could do is put out a request for anyone that's kind of recognises that encounter without knowing the name to come forward.
Yeah, anybody who has ever had sexual intercourse, protected sexual intercourse by joint agreement after a night in the pub in somebody's flat, please come forward.
Please contact
John Mitting.
Contact John Mitting directly.
Yeah, between what years was it? I think like between like 69 and 73 or something. So that 4 years. Yeah, perhaps we can see what. Yeah, let's ask Twitter to find them.
That's not actually a bad idea.
Not a terrible idea.
Has Mitting got a Twitter account that we can spam?
Jesus Christ! I mean, he barely seems to know how to use the bloody the audio when he's at the inquiry. I can't imagine him doing any kind of social.
Sir,
media.
You're on mute, sir. Yeah. Sir, you're on mute. Yeah, well, here's another one. Yeah, HN 21 was married when deployed. He said that he had protected sexual intercourse on 2 occasions. They're more worried that it was protected sex, aren't they, than anything else. On 2 occasions with a woman attending a course, he admitted to kissing and fondling another woman on the same course. The inquiry has made efforts to trace the women concerned without success. Subject to the possibility that she may be traced and may contradict this account, Mitting chose to believe the evidence given by HN 21 was the truth. But yeah, again, any woman that's had protected sexual intercourse on 2 occasions with someone with HN 21, yeah, no name given. Again, it's ridiculous.
Like we said at the beginning, we didn't expect much from the interim report. We didn't get a great amount of much, but the headline thing of that the unit should have been shut down was great to have, but once you start digging in there, it's just yet more being infuriated by the whole bloody thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I like say I'm due to give evidence at some point next year, and yeah, and part of me thinks is it worth it? Because I don't think the fact that I've been quite critical about, the inquiry and several things, and I've also criticised Mitting, himself. It's, I've probably shot myself in the foot because, it's going to be down to whether or not, he believes me or, the liar Andy Coles. So, yeah,
your coverage of the inquiry has been excellent. You've followed proceedings with sense and good grace and called things as they actually are. And I would recommend that everybody follows. What is your Twitter handle again?
Jessica Me Too.
2 with the number 2, yeah.
Yes,
everybody follow that. I mean, if you want to have like sensible insights into what's happening with the inquiry, it's the most sensible account on.
It's with sarcasm and foul language and. Yes,
it's the value.
Yeah, no one retweets it. No one that sort of, police spies out of lives won't retweet it because
I do.
It just won't. Oh, and yeah, I know you do, but you also swear, Tom.
I also do if I ever log into Twitter, which is not very often.
Well, I won't be able to. Tom, you're going to have to tweet for me when I'm giving evidence.
Sure.
looking forward.
Yeah. In theory, I mean, it feels like an incredibly long way away again. I don't actually believe it's going to happen next year. I mean, maybe it will, but I could easily see it being the year after.
I think I was initially told I'd be giving evidence in around Easter next year, but then I was also told that I would get disclosure in September last year, and I still haven't had it now. So,
have you not had anything yet?
Nope, nothing.
Bloody hell!
Yeah,
behind, aren't they?
Yes, yeah. It's ridiculous, and sort of all the hoops that I've got to jump through to sort of name people that I'm able to talk about things with, because it's going to be, I think, quite traumatic to be sitting there and reading through basically, the Coles's account of everything, given that he's trying to he's trying to call me, an extremist and all this crap that he's said. And just like to, the accounts or the way that the reports are written, sort of like just, making fun of the activists and just sort of that disrespect, and that it's going to be difficult to read it. And, essentially I will be sat reading it on my own. So, I have to nominate people who will be allowed to, that I'll be allowed to talk to about it. And so like they've all got to have signed restriction orders and everything. It's there's a lot of hoops.
One of the things that the Boiling Employment Tribunal, Disciplinary Tribunal said apparently was that weary, the term that undercover officers from a certain date refer to activist as, is actually a pejorative, a prejudiced term, which is quite an interesting thing for it to say, I think, because it speaks against Mitting's idea that it wasn't a bias, and clearly it won't be. It's a bit odd even to try and be put in a position where you're trying to argue that there wasn't a political bias. That is actually what he said, but it's clearly just another bit of evidence which proves that there was a clear bias within the unit.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably a conversation for another time and a whole other podcast, really. But I am an extremist. I was an extremist. I still am an extremist. And I don't think that makes any of what happened okay. And in some ways, I'm quite looking forward to giving evidence to the public inquiry, because I think, this idea that, in some kind of context, it is appropriate to spy on people for the political beliefs that they have. And you'll see it in a lot of the MPOIU's authorizations, there are phrases that are essentially referring to thought crime. They were spying on us because of what we believed. They were spying on us because maybe at that time, believing that climate change was a real thing and that we needed to do something about it was an extreme position. It's not an extreme position anymore. And that is the point about extreme political ideologies, is they open up political space for ideas that eventually become mainstream. And they are an essential part of, a healthy, functioning democracy. You need to be able to think outside the box. And that makes you an extremist, and it doesn't make you a legitimate target for police spying. And I think we need to push that. I mean, there are the authorization for Mark Kennedy that the IPT very clearly found was not a legitimate and justified reason for spying on people, used the word or variations on the word extreme and extremist 20 times in 4 pages. And that's not enough. It wasn't enough for the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, and I doubt it's going to be enough for the inquiry, although I think Mitting is going to find it is going to be an easier person to convince than because of his own innate political bias.
I mean, it's quite interesting that I think in some of the meetings that people had with Mitting, somebody asked him, have you ever been to a demonstration? And he was, oh God, no. It was that sort of horror of the thought of him going to any kind of demonstration, as though that was some sort of extremist thing. That was, I forget which group it was that asked him, but that's, I think, very telling of just what he, I mean, why would he? What has he ever, I don't know what he would ever have to sort of, complain about. Is it what you can't beat the staff anymore? You know, I don't know what a man in his position would have to you know, to demonstrate about.
Is there anything else anybody wants to add about the interim report?
I don't think so. I think sort of like we've gone backwards and forwards over most of it, haven't we?
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us on the Spike Ops Info podcast for this chat. We'll hopefully be doing, like, the next episode won't be as long a gap as it was between this one and the last one. But you never know, it might be. Who knows? Please support the podcast by sharing it with your friends and giving us a review on whatever platform you listen to it on, and encouraging other people to subscribe. If you want to get in touch with us, you can find all the previous episodes at spycops.info. Cheers for listening.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.